Heat is time. This is the principle that most frontier builders failed to understand, and the failure cost them sleep, health, and wood, enormous quantities of wood. A cast iron stove converts wood into heat in approximately 2 hours. A full load of seasoned hardwood, 8 to 10 pounds of split oak or maple, burns to ash in 90 minutes to 2 hours at moderate draft, releasing approximately 60,000 BTUs of thermal energy during the burn cycle. The problem is not the quantity of heat produced. The problem is the duration. 60,000 BTUs released over 2 hours heats a cabin to 70 degrees in 30 minutes and maintains that temperature for the remaining 90 minutes of the burn. Then the fire dies. The stove cools. The cabin cools. Within 2 hours of the last ember dying, the cabin temperature has dropped 15 to 20 degrees, and within 4 hours it has dropped 30 degrees, reaching the low 40s or high 30s by dawn. Cold enough to see your breath, cold enough to freeze the water in the basin, cold enough that getting out of bed becomes an act of will, rather than a natural transition from sleep to waking. The frontier solution to this problem was simple and brutal. Wake in the night and feed the stove. Every family on the northern frontier had a nighttime fire routine. Someone, usually the husband, sometimes the wife, occasionally an older child, woke at 2 or 3 in the morning, stumbled to the stove in the dark, opened the firebox, and loaded fresh wood. The reload took 5 minutes. The person stood shivering in the 35-degree cabin while the fresh wood caught, and the stove began to radiate heat again, then climbed back into bed and slept, or tried to sleep, until dawn, when the cycle repeated. This nighttime interruption occurred every night from November through March, approximately 150 nights per year. And the cumulative effect on sleep quality, daytime alertness, and physical health was devastating. Chronic sleep disruption weakened immune function, slowed physical recovery from the hard labor of frontier life, and created a persistent fog of fatigue that made every task harder and every decision worse. The wood consumption of the nighttime reload was also significant. The 2 o'clock feeding added approximately 1/3 of a cord to the winter's total fuel consumption, 500 to 600 pounds of wood that served no purpose other than preventing the cabin from reaching freezing temperatures during the 4 hours between the evening fire and dawn. This was wood that had to be felled, bucked, split, and stacked during the short summer and fall, competing for labor with every other task that the season demanded. Now, Hamid Anvari did not wake at 2 in the morning. He had not woken at 2 in the morning since his second winter on the New Mexico frontier, because he had solved the problem of heat duration in a way that no one in the settlement had seen before, and that most dismissed as foolish when they first encountered it. Hamid had arrived in the high desert country of northern New Mexico Territory in 1891, traveling south from Denver with his wife Parisa and their supplies on a freight wagon. He was 41 years old, a compact man with a dark, weathered face, deep-set brown eyes, a thick black mustache going gray at the corners, and the hands of someone who had worked with fire and metal for most of his life. In the city of Kashan, in central Persia, Hamid had been a metal worker, not a blacksmith in the European sense, but a coppersmith, a maker of samovars and braziers and the elaborate copper vessels that were central to Persian domestic life. His father had been a coppersmith, and his grandfather, and the knowledge that Hamid carried was not learned from books but absorbed through decades of watching, touching, and shaping metal over heat. The Persians understood heat storage. The concept was embedded in their architecture, their cooking, their bathing, and their daily routines in ways that Europeans did not replicate and Americans had never encountered. The Persian corsi, a low table placed over a brazier of hot coals with a heavy blanket draped over the table and spread across the laps of the family seated around it, was a heat storage device. The corsi did not heat the room, it heated the people, using the thermal mass of the coals to deliver warmth directly to the body over a period of 6 to 8 hours from a single charging of the brazier. The tandoor oven, a clay cylinder heated by burning wood until the walls reached 600 degrees, then used for baking bread by pressing dough against the hot clay surfaces, was a heat storage device. The wood burned in 20 minutes. The baking continued for 2 hours, powered entirely by the heat stored in the thermal mass of the clay walls. The hammam, the Persian bathhouse, used massive stone and brick walls heated by furnaces beneath the floor to maintain a constant temperature for hours after the fires were banked. The principle in all of these applications was the same: convert a brief intense fire into a long slow release of stored heat by interposing a mass of dense material between the fire and the space to be heated. The dense material, clay, stone, brick, sand, copper, absorbs heat during the burn and releases it slowly over hours after the burn ends. The larger the mass, the more heat it stores. The denser the material, the more heat it stores per unit of volume. And the slower the release, the longer the warmth persists. Hamid looked at the American frontier stove and saw a machine that was brilliant at producing heat and terrible at storing it. The cast iron stove was a thin shell, walls 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch thick, that heated rapidly and cooled rapidly. It was, thermally, the opposite of a corsi, or a tandoor, or a hammam. It converted wood to heat in 2 hours and lost that heat to the room in 2 hours, and when the fire died, the stove was cold within 90 minutes. The stove had no thermal mass. It was a heat flashbulb, bright, hot, and gone. Parisa saw the problem first. On their first November night in the cabin, she woke at 3 in the morning to a temperature she estimated at 32 degrees, freezing, and told Hamid that this was not acceptable. In Kashan, no one woke cold. The corsi kept the family warm all night. The house walls, 2 feet of adobe brick, held the day's heat until morning. The idea that a family should wake in the night to feed a fire was, to Parisa, evidence of a building tradition that had failed to solve a problem that Persian builders had solved 1,000 years ago. Hamid agreed, but the solution was not obvious. He could not build a corsi in a frontier cabin. The charcoal fumes would be dangerous in a sealed room. He could not rebuild the cabin with 2-foot adobe walls. The structure was already built from pine logs. He could not install a masonry heater. He lacked the fire brick and the skill. But he could add thermal mass to the existing stove, and the material he chose was sand. Sand. Common, free, available in unlimited quantities from the arroyo that ran 100 yards from the cabin. Sand is dense, approximately 100 pounds per cubic foot, and it has a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.19 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit, which means that 100 pounds of sand heated from 60 degrees to 160 degrees absorbs approximately 1,900 BTUs of thermal energy. That energy is released slowly as the sand cools, and the rate of release depends on the insulation around the sand. Exposed sand in open air loses its heat in 2 to 3 hours, but sand enclosed in a structure with moderate insulation can release its heat over 8 to 12 hours. If you want to know what happened when a Persian coppersmith set his stove on 2 feet of sand while every neighbor said he was building his fire on a beach, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. The construction began in September of 1892, during the warm days when the ground was dry and the sand was easy to work. Hamid built a containment box on the cabin floor directly beneath the stove location. The box was 4 feet wide, 5 feet long, and 24 inches deep, framed from 2-inch pine planks nailed together and reinforced at the corners with iron angle brackets that Hamid forged himself from bar stock. The box sat on the cabin floor with its top edge flush with the surrounding floor surface, creating a recessed pit 2 feet deep. The bottom and sides of the box were lined with a layer of flat stones, river cobbles split in half to create flat faces, laid dry without mortar and fitted tightly together. The stone lining served 2 purposes. It protected the wooden box from the heat that would accumulate in the sand, and it added thermal mass to the system. The stone lining was approximately 3 inches thick on all surfaces, and it added approximately 400 pounds of additional thermal mass to the system. The box was filled with clean, dry sand from the arroyo, screened through a coarse mesh to remove rocks, roots, and organic debris that might decompose and create odors. The sand was poured into the box in layers, each layer tamped firmly with a flat wooden rammer to compress it and eliminate air pockets. Air pockets would reduce the thermal conductivity of the sand bed, slowing the transfer of heat from the stove above into the sand mass below. Compressed sand has approximately twice the thermal conductivity of loose sand, and the compression was essential for the system to function as designed. The completed sand bed weighed approximately 1,200 pounds, 1,000 pounds of sand, plus 200 pounds of stone lining, contained in a wooden box that transferred essentially no heat to the cabin floor below, because wood is a poor thermal conductor. The sand bed represented a thermal battery with a storage capacity of approximately 15,000 BTUs, when heated from its resting temperature of 55 degrees to its operating temperature of 140 degrees. Enough thermal energy to maintain a cabin floor temperature of 55 to 60 degrees for approximately 8 hours after the stove fire died, assuming moderate insulation in the cabin walls and roof. The stove was placed directly on top of the sand bed, with its 4 cast iron legs sinking approximately 2 inches into the top layer of sand. The sand filled the gaps around the legs and conformed to the stove base, creating a large contact area between the hot stove bottom and the sand surface. The stove bottom, the hottest surface of the stove during operation, reached temperatures of 300 to 400 degrees during a full burn, and this heat conducted directly into the sand below through the contact area. The total cost of the installation was $14, $6 for the lumber, pine planks and corner posts for the box, $2 for iron hardware, angle brackets and lag bolts, and $6 for Hamid's labor over 4 days. The sand was free. The stones were free. The only purchased materials were the lumber and hardware. The first test came on the night of October 23, 1892, the first hard freeze of the season, when the temperature dropped to 21 degrees by midnight. Hamid loaded the stove with a full charge of piñon pine at 8 in the evening, approximately 10 pounds of dense resinous wood that burned hot and clean. The stove reached full operating temperature within 30 minutes, and the cabin temperature climbed to 68 degrees by 9 o'clock. Hamid and Parisa went to bed at 9:30. The fire burned at moderate draft until approximately 10:15, when the last of the wood was consumed and the flames died. In a conventional installation, stove on legs on a bare floor, the stove would have been cold by midnight, and the cabin would have reached the low 40s by 2 in the morning. But the sand bed changed the equation. During the 2-hour burn, the sand directly beneath the stove had absorbed heat continuously, and the temperature in the top 6 inches of sand had risen to approximately 140 degrees. The sand in the middle layer had reached approximately 100 degrees. The sand in the bottom layer, insulated from the cabin floor by the stone lining and the wooden box, had reached approximately 75 degrees. The entire sand mass, 1,200 pounds, was a thermal reservoir charged with approximately 12,000 BTUs of stored energy. After the fire died, the stove began to cool. But instead of cooling to room temperature in 90 minutes as it would on a bare floor, the stove cooled slowly because the hot sand beneath it was conducting heat upward into the stove base. Partially replacing the heat, the stove was radiating into the room. The sand, in effect, was feeding heat to the stove from below at the same rate the stove was losing heat to the room above. The stove remained warm to the touch, not hot, but warm, perhaps 120 degrees, for 4 hours after the fire died. The cabin temperature dropped slowly, from 68 degrees at 10 o'clock to 62 at midnight, to 57 at 2 in the morning, to 53 at 4 to 50 at 6, when Hamid woke and reloaded the stove. The total temperature drop overnight was 18 degrees, from 68 to 50, compared to the 30-degree drop that occurred in conventional cabins over the same period. 50 degrees at 6 in the morning, not warm, but not freezing, not 35 degrees, which was the typical dawn temperature in conventional cabins. Not cold enough to freeze the water in the basin, not cold enough to see your breath, not cold enough to make getting out of bed a physical ordeal. 50 degrees was the temperature of a cool room, uncomfortable in shirt sleeves, but tolerable, and warm enough that the stove could bring the cabin back to 65 within 20 minutes of the morning fire. And Hamid had not woken at 2 in the morning. Parisa had not woken. No one had stumbled to the stove in the dark, shivering in 35-degree air, fumbling with kindling and matches. They had slept a full 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep, and woken at dawn to a cabin that was cool but livable. The fuel savings were immediate and significant. Before the sand bed, Hamid burned approximately 4 cords of pinon pine per winter, roughly the same as every other cabin in the settlement. After the sand bed, the first winter's consumption dropped to approximately 3 cords, a 25% reduction. The nighttime reload, which had consumed approximately 1/3 of a cord per winter, was eliminated entirely. The remaining savings came from the thermal flywheel effect of the sand bed during the day. The sand absorbed excess heat during peak burn periods, when the stove was running hot after a fresh load, and released it during low periods, when the fire was burning down, smoothing the temperature oscillations that wasted heat in conventional installations. If this story has touched you, share it and subscribe, because the quiet engineering that kept families alive and farms running for generations deserves to be remembered. Walt Henshaw, who ranched a quarter section to the north, visited Hamid's cabin in January of 1893 on a morning when the outdoor temperature was 11 degrees. He had come to buy a copper pot that Hamid was making for him, and he arrived at 7 in the morning expecting the usual frontier welcome: a cold cabin, a freshly lit stove, and a host apologizing for the chill while the fire caught up to the room. Instead, he found Hamid and Parisa eating breakfast in a cabin that was already 58 degrees, the stove burning at a low idle, and the floor around the stove warm to the touch. Henshaw put his hand on the floor beside the stove and felt the warmth radiating up through the planks from the sandbed below. He asked what was under the floor. Hamid showed him. Henshaw's reaction was skepticism. He said that sand was dirt, that dirt did not hold heat, and that the warmth Henshaw was feeling must be from the morning fire, not from sand that had been heated the night before. Hamid offered a demonstration. He opened the stove and showed Henshaw the firebox. The morning fire had been burning for less than 40 minutes and had consumed perhaps 3 pounds of wood. The stovetop was warm but not hot, perhaps 180 degrees, the temperature of a stove that had been burning for less than an hour. Then Hamid pushed a thin iron rod, a piece of bar stock, 2 feet long, into the sand beside the stove. He left it for 30 seconds and pulled it out. The rod was hot to the touch, not burn your hand hot, but distinctly warm, perhaps 110 degrees. The sand, 12 hours after the fire had died, was still holding heat from the previous evening's burn. Henshaw held the rod and said nothing for a full minute. Henshaw asked 3 questions. First, how much did it cost? $14. Second, how much wood had Hamid saved? Approximately 1 cord per winter, worth $6 to $8 at local prices. Third, could Henshaw build one? Hamid said yes. The construction was simple, and he offered to help. Henshaw built his sand bed in February of 1893, an unusual time for construction, but Henshaw was motivated by the immediate prospect of eliminating his nightly 2 o'clock wake-up. The installation took 3 days with Hamid's help, and the results were immediate. Henshaw's first full night of sleep without a 2 o'clock interruption was February 19th, and he told Hamid afterward that it was the best night's sleep he had gotten since arriving in New Mexico 4 years earlier. The depth of the sand bed mattered. Hamid had chosen 24 inches based on his experience with heat storage in Persian applications. The tandoor walls were approximately 4 inches of dense clay, and the Corsi brazier held approximately 20 pounds of charcoal, both of which provided 6 to 8 hours of heat storage. 24 inches of sand, at 100 pounds per cubic foot, provided approximately 2,000 pounds of thermal mass, including the stone lining, per stove installation, which stored enough heat for 8 hours of slow release in the New Mexico climate, where winter nights dropped to the teens and 20s, but rarely below 0. Parisa suggested a refinement after the first winter that improved the system significantly. She observed that the sand surface around the stove, the area not directly beneath the stove base, cooled faster than the sand beneath the stove, because it was exposed to the cabin air and lost heat by radiation and convection from the surface. She proposed covering the exposed sand surface with flat clay tiles, left over from a neighbor's roof project, which would insulate the surface, reduce the radiant heat loss, and create a smooth, clean floor surface around the stove that could be swept and maintained. Hamid laid the tiles in the spring of 1893, and the following winter the overnight temperature performance improved by approximately 3 degrees. The 6 o'clock dawn temperature rose from 50 to 53 degrees, because the tiles reduced the heat loss from the sand surface by approximately 20%. The Henshaw's neighbor, a rancher named Co. Driscoll, visited Henshaw's cabin in March 1893 and declared the sand bed a waste of good floor space. Driscoll was a practical man who measured everything in dollars and labor, and who saw no value in a system that required 4 days of work to install and saved, by Henshaw's accounting, approximately 1 cord of wood per year, a savings of $6 to $8 against a construction cost of $14. The payback period, Driscoll calculated, was 2 years. He could endure 2 more winters of 2 o'clock wake-ups for the price of not building a sand bed. But Driscoll's calculation omitted the value of sleep, and it was sleep, not fuel, that proved to be the sand bed's most compelling benefit. The families with sand beds slept 8 hours without interruption. The families without sand beds slept in 2 4-hour blocks separated by a cold, miserable 20-minute interlude at 2 in the morning. The difference in morning alertness, daytime energy, and overall winter disposition was dramatic and visible. Hamid and Parisa began each day rested and calm. Their neighbors began each day tired and irritable, carrying the accumulated sleep debt of weeks and months of disrupted rest. By February, the sleep-deprived families were visibly haggard. Dark circles under their eyes, short tempers, slow reactions, and the general appearance of people who had been gently tortured for 3 months. Driscoll's wife, Mercy, made the decision for the family. In March 1893, she told Coe that she would not spend another winter waking at 2 in the morning, and that the sand bed would be installed in September, or Coe would be the one waking in the night for every night of the next winter. Coe built the sand bed in September. Mercy slept through the following winter without waking once. The December blizzard of 1895 tested the sand bed under extreme conditions. The storm dropped the temperature to 4 below zero with sustained winds of 35 miles per hour for 2 days. Hamid loaded the stove with a double charge of dense pignon at 8 in the evening, and again at 10, a total of approximately 20 pounds of wood, which burned until midnight. The sand bed absorbed heat for 4 hours and reached a peak temperature of approximately 160 degrees in the upper layers. After the fire died at midnight, the sand released its stored heat into the cabin over the next 8 hours. The cabin temperature at midnight was 66 degrees, at 2, 59, at 4, 53, at 6, 48, at 8, when Hamid woke and reloaded the stove, 45 degrees, 45 degrees at 8 in the morning with 4 below zero air outside and the fire dead for 8 hours. In Henshaw's cabin, which also had a sand bed, the temperature was 47. In Driscoll's cabin, sand bed installed in September, the temperature was 46. In the cabins without sand beds, the temperatures ranged from 28 to 34 degrees, below freezing in 2 cases, with ice on the water basins and frost on the interior walls. The difference was not marginal. It was the difference between a cold room and a frozen room. It was the difference between bare feet on a cool floor and bare feet on a floor that caused pain. It was the difference between waking naturally and waking to the emergency of a freezing cabin that demanded immediate action. The sand bed did not keep the cabin warm. It kept the cabin from reaching the critical threshold where cold became dangerous, and it did so passively, automatically, without human intervention, using energy that had been stored hours earlier from a fire that no longer existed. By 1898, 7 families in the settlement had installed sand beds beneath their stoves. The installations varied in size, from Hamid's original 4 by 5 foot, 24-inch deep bed to a smaller 3 by 4 foot, 18-inch deep version that a widow named Adela Fuentes built with her teenage son, which stored less heat but still extended the overnight warmth by 5 hours compared to a bare floor. The cost ranged from $12 to $18 per installation, and every family reported the same primary benefit: uninterrupted sleep. The secondary benefits accumulated over years. The sand bed stabilized the cabin temperature throughout the day, reducing the peak-to-trough temperature swings from 30 degrees, 68 at peak burn, to 38 at dawn, to 18 degrees, 68 at peak, to 50 at dawn, in moderate winter conditions. The stabilized temperature reduced the thermal cycling stress on the cabin structure. Logs that expanded and contracted showed less chinking failure, fewer gaps at window frames, and longer intervals between maintenance. The warm floor zone around the stove, an area approximately 6 feet in diameter where the sand bed's radiant heat kept the floor at 55 to 60 degrees, became the social center of the cabin, the place where the family gathered in the evening and where the children played, warm and comfortable on a surface that would have been freezing cold in a conventional installation. The sand bed also protected the cabin floor from fire damage. The cast iron stove, at 300 to 400 degrees during peak burn, would char and eventually ignite a wooden floor if placed directly on it, a fire risk that frontier builders addressed with a tin sheet or stone slab beneath the stove legs. The 2-foot sand bed eliminated this risk entirely because the sand absorbed and distributed the heat over its entire mass rather than concentrating it at the 4 contact points of the stove legs. The floor beneath the wooden box never exceeded 80 degrees, even during sustained peak burns, well below the ignition temperature of wood, and well below the temperature that would cause charring or weakening of the floor structure. The maintenance of the sand bed was minimal. The sand did not degrade, decompose, rot, or lose its thermal properties over time. Sand is geologically stable. It is essentially finely ground rock, and it retains its specific heat capacity and density indefinitely. The wooden box required inspection every 2 to 3 years for signs of drying, cracking, or loosening at the joints. And the iron hardware required occasional tightening, but the sand itself was a permanent installation that would function identically in the 20th year as it did in the first. Hamid's original sand bed, installed in September 1892, was still in service and performing identically when the cabin was sold in 1908. 16 years of continuous operation with no maintenance, no replacement, and no degradation of performance. The science of the sand bed was simple enough that Hamid could explain it to any visitor in 5 minutes, using terms that any farmer understood. Sand absorbs heat when it is hot and releases heat when it is cold. The more sand, the more heat it absorbs. The deeper the sand, the longer it takes to cool. 2 feet of sand under a stove absorbs enough heat during a 2-hour evening fire to keep the floor warm for 8 hours after the fire dies. The wood you do not burn at 2 in the morning is the wood you do not have to cut in August. Parisa added a second refinement in the winter of 1896 that addressed the one complaint she had about the system. The sand bed heated the floor around the stove beautifully, but the far corners of the cabin, 8 to 10 feet from the stove, remained cold because the radiant heat from the sand surface could not reach them. Her solution was to place 4 flat river stones, each approximately 8 inches in diameter and 2 inches thick, weighing about 5 pounds, on the stovetop during the evening burn, where they heated to approximately 200 degrees. At bedtime, she wrapped each stone in a layer of burlap and placed 2 under the bed and 2 in the far corners of the cabin on small wooden stands. The stones released their heat slowly over 4 to 5 hours, raising the temperature in the far corners by approximately 8 degrees and creating a more uniform temperature distribution throughout the cabin. The heated stones were a portable extension of the sand bed principle. thermal mass charged during the burn cycle and deployed where the heat was needed most. The tradition spread beyond the immediate settlement. A traveling merchant named Eldon Shea, who passed through the area twice a year buying hides and selling supplies, noticed the sandbed in Hamid's cabin during a January 1896 visit and asked detailed questions about the construction and performance. Shea had customers across northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, and over the next 3 years he described the sandbed to dozens of families in isolated settlements and ranches. At least 4 installations that Hamid knew of, and probably more that he did not, were built by families who had never met Hamid, but who had heard the description from Shea and understood the principle well enough to execute the construction independently. The design was simple enough to transmit by word of mouth, and the materials were available everywhere. Hamid continued to refine his coppersmithing work throughout his years in New Mexico, producing samovars, cooking vessels, and copper hardware for the settlement and surrounding ranches. But the sandbed, the simplest thing he ever built, the project that used no copper and required no metalworking skill, was the contribution that the community remembered. It was the thing that changed their nights, that gave them sleep, that turned winter from an endurance test into a manageable season. Hamid lived on the homestead until 1908, when he and Parisa moved to Santa Fe to be closer to their grandchildren. The cabin and the sandbed passed to a ranching family who used both for another 12 years. The weight of the sandbed raised a structural concern that Hamid addressed before construction. 1,200 pounds concentrated in a 4 by 5 foot area, 60 pounds per square foot, exceeded the typical floor load capacity of a frontier cabin, which was designed for the distributed weight of occupants and furniture at approximately 20 to 30 pounds per square foot. If the sandbed were placed on the existing floor without reinforcement, the floor joists beneath it would deflect, possibly crack, and eventually fail. Hamid reinforced the floor beneath the sandbed location before installing the box. He added 2 supplemental joists, hewn from 6-inch diameter pine logs, directly beneath the box footprint, sistered alongside the existing joists, and spiked to them with iron spikes. The supplemental joists doubled the bearing capacity of the floor in the sandbed area, and Hamid added a stone pier beneath the midspan of each supplemental joist, a stack of flat stones rising from the ground surface to the joist underside, to eliminate the midspan deflection that would occur under the concentrated load. The reinforcement added $3 to the project cost for the lumber and spikes, and 1 day to the construction time, but it ensured that the 1,200-pound sandbed sat on a floor structure that could support it indefinitely without deflection or failure. The heat distribution pattern within the sandbed followed predictable physics. The sand directly beneath the stove base, the top 2 to 3 inches in a circle, approximately 18 inches in diameter, reached the highest temperature, approximately 160 degrees during a full 2-hour burn. The heat conducted downward and outward from this hot zone in a roughly hemispherical pattern, with the temperature decreasing with distance from the stove base. At 12 inches below the stove, halfway down the sandbed, the temperature reached approximately 100 degrees during the burn. At 24 inches, the bottom of the bed, the temperature reached approximately 75 degrees. Laterally, the heat spread approximately 8 to 10 inches beyond the stove footprint in all directions, so that the effective heating zone in the sand was approximately 3 feet in diameter and 2 feet deep. A roughly cylindrical mass of heated sand weighing approximately 600 pounds that contain the majority of the stored thermal energy. The outer portions of the sand bed, the corners and edges of the 4x5-foot box that were more than 10 inches from the stove footprint, reached lower peak temperatures of 65 to 75 degrees and served primarily as insulation for the heated core, slowing the lateral heat loss and directing the stored energy upward toward the cabin floor and the stove base. The rate of heat release after the fire died followed a declining curve that Hamid learned to predict with reasonable accuracy after 2 winters of observation. During the first hour after the fire died, roughly 11 to midnight in his typical evening routine, the sand released heat at the highest rate, approximately 1,000 BTUs per hour, because the temperature difference between the hot sand and the cooling cabin was greatest. During the second and third hours, midnight to 2, the rate declined to approximately 800 BTUs per hour as the sand cooled and the temperature difference narrowed. By the fourth and fifth hours, 2 to 4 in the morning, the rate was approximately 500 BTUs per hour. By the 6th through 8th hours, 4 to 6 or 8, the rate dropped to approximately 300 BTUs per hour. A trickle of warmth, but enough to prevent the cabin from reaching the freezing threshold that turned discomfort into danger. The cumulative heat released over the 8-hour period was approximately 5,000 BTUs. Modest compared to the 60,000 BTUs of the original fire, but delivered at precisely the time when it was needed most, the small hours when the fire was dead and the cabin was cooling. The 5,000 BTUs of stored heat did not keep the cabin warm. They kept it above 45 degrees, which was the threshold that Hamid had identified as the boundary between tolerable cold and dangerous cold. The temperature below which water froze, breath condensed, and bare skin on cold surfaces became painful. The radiant floor heating effect was an important secondary benefit. The sand bed, heated to 140 degrees in the upper layers, radiated heat upward through the stove base, and also laterally through the floor planks that covered the sandbox. The floor surface within a 6-foot radius of the stove reached temperatures of 55 to 60 degrees during the evening, warm enough for bare feet, warm enough for children to sit and play, and maintained temperatures of 48 to 52 degrees through the night. This radiant floor warmth was fundamentally different from the convective warmth produced by the stove itself. Convective heat rises. It warms the ceiling first and the floor last, creating the temperature stratification that makes conventional cabins warm at head height and cold at floor level. Radiant heat from the sand bed warmed the floor directly, from below, creating a zone of warmth at the level where the occupants actually lived, slept, and worked. The combination of convective heat from the stove, warming the upper room, and radiant heat from the sand bed, warming the lower room, produced a more uniform temperature distribution from floor to ceiling than either source alone could achieve. The piñon pine that Hamid burned was well suited to the sandbed system. Piñon is a dense resinous wood with a heat content of approximately 22 million BTUs per cord, higher than most hardwoods and significantly higher than the softwoods, spruce, fir, pine, that were the primary fuel in most frontier regions. The high heat content meant that a full stove load of piñon produced more BTUs per pound than the same weight of softer wood, charging the sandbed more thoroughly with each burn cycle. The resinous quality of the wood also produced a hotter flame. Piñon burns at approximately 1,500 degrees compared to 1,200 for non-resinous softwoods, which transferred more heat to the stove and thence to the sand per unit of burn time. A family burning spruce or fir would need to burn a larger charge, or burn longer to achieve the same sandbed charging that Hamid achieved with Pignon. The altitude of the settlement, approximately 6,500 feet above sea level, created conditions that amplified both the problem and the solution. At altitude, the thin, dry air lost heat rapidly through radiation to the clear night sky, and nighttime temperatures dropped faster and farther than at lower elevations. A January night that might reach 20 degrees at 3,000 feet would reach 5 degrees at 6,500 feet, and the thin, dry air provided less insulation against radiant heat loss from building surfaces. The sandbed's thermal mass was therefore more valuable at altitude than it would have been at lower elevations because the temperature drop it had to buffer against was larger and the heat loss rate was faster. Conversely, the dry, high-altitude climate benefited the sandbed construction. The sand from the arroyo was naturally dry, less than 2% moisture content, and it remained dry in the enclosed box because the arid climate produced almost no ground moisture to wick upward through the stone lining. In a wetter climate, the Pacific Northwest, the Great Lakes region, the eastern seaboard, the sandbed would require a moisture barrier beneath the box to prevent ground moisture from saturating the sand, which would reduce its thermal performance by approximately 30%. Wet sand conducts heat faster than dry sand, which means it releases its stored heat more quickly, shortening the overnight warmth duration. The community's experience with the sandbed over 6 winters, 1892 through 1898, produced a consistent data set of performance metrics. Average overnight temperature drop, stove to dawn, 8-hour period. 18 degrees with sandbed versus 30 degrees without. Average dawn temperature, 48 to 52 degrees with sandbed versus 32 to 38 degrees without. Average fuel consumption per winter, 3 cords with sandbed versus 4 cords without. Sleep interruptions per winter, 0 with sandbed versus approximately 150 without. 1 per night, November through March. Annual fuel savings, 1 cord, valued at $6 to $8. Construction cost, $12 to $18. Payback period, 2 to 3 winters on fuel alone, immediate on sleep quality. Hamid's son-in-law, a young carpenter named Cyrus Tabatabai, who married Hamid's daughter Shirin in 1899, refined the sandbed design for new construction. Instead of building the box as an insert on the existing floor, Cyrus framed the sandbed into the floor structure during initial construction, dropping the floor joists around the stove location to create an integrated pit that was structurally part of the floor frame rather than a separate box sitting on top of it. The integrated design was stronger because the joists carried the sand load directly to the foundation without relying on the floor surface as an intermediate bearing member, and it was cleaner because the sandbed surface was flush with the surrounding floor with no visible box edges or joints. Cyrus built 3 cabins with integrated sandbeds between 1900 and 1905, and the design became the standard for new construction in the settlement. The comparison between Hamid's sandbed and the alternatives available in the settlement for overnight heat retention was decisive. The primary alternative was the soapstone stove, a cast-iron stove with soapstone panels bolted to the sides, which added approximately 200 pounds of thermal mass to the stove body. Soapstone stoves were effective. They extended the heat release after the fire died by approximately 2 to 3 hours. But they were expensive, $45 to $60 for a soapstone-equipped stove, compared to $12 to $18 for a sandbed beneath a standard stove, and they stored less total energy than the sandbed because 200 pounds of soapstone held less heat than 1,200 pounds of sand. The soapstone stove was a better heat flashbulb, brighter and slightly longer, but the sand bed was a thermal battery that operated on a fundamentally different timescale. The second alternative was the masonry heater, a massive structure of fire brick and stone with internal flue channels that absorbed heat during a brief, intense burn and released it over 12 to 24 hours. Masonry heaters were the gold standard of heat storage, capable of maintaining a cabin at 60 degrees for an entire day from a single 2-hour fire. But they required specialized construction skills, hundreds of pounds of fire brick, and a foundation capable of supporting 3,000 to 5,000 pounds. The total cost of a masonry heater, materials, skilled labor, and foundation, ranged from $100 to $200, and no one in the settlement had the fire brick or the skill to build one. The sandbed achieved approximately 40% of the masonry heater's performance at 10% of the cost, using materials available to any homesteader with access to a sandy arroyo and a saw. The third alternative was simply burning more wood, loading the stove with a larger charge of dense hardwood that would burn slowly over a longer period. This approach worked to a degree. A tightly packed stove with the draft closed to minimum would smolder for 4 to 5 hours instead of 2. But slow smoldering combustion was inefficient, producing less heat per pound of wood and generating more creosote in the chimney, which increased the risk of chimney fires. The sandbed allowed the stove to burn at its most efficient rate, hot and clean, with the draft open to moderate, while the sand captured and time-shifted the heat into the overnight hours. Efficient combustion during the evening, passive heat release during the night. The stove did what stoves do best, burn hot, and the sand did what sand does best, hold heat. The emotional impact of the sandbed on frontier families cannot be overstated, because the 2 o'clock wake-up was more than an inconvenience. It was a nightly trauma that accumulated over months, the experience of waking in the dark to bitter cold, of forcing yourself out of warm blankets into air that burned your lungs, of kneeling on a frozen floor to open the stove and feed wood into the dead firebox, of waiting, shivering, half awake, miserable, for the fire to catch and the first wave of warmth to reach your hands, and then climbing back into a bed that had cooled during the 20 minutes you were out of it. This experience, repeated every night for 5 months, was a grinding psychological burden that colored the entire winter with dread. Families did not fear the cold. They feared the 2 o'clock wake-up. It was the single most hated aspect of frontier winter life, more dreaded than the isolation, the short days, the monotony of preserved food, or the hard physical labor of snow clearing and animal care. When Mercy Driscoll told Coe that she would not spend another winter waking at 2 in the morning, she was expressing a sentiment that every frontier spouse understood at a visceral level. The sandbed removed the dread. It did not make winter warm. It did not eliminate the cold, the darkness, the isolation, or the hard work. But it eliminated the one thing that made winter genuinely unbearable: the nightly interruption that broke every night's sleep into 2 inadequate halves and ensured that no one was ever truly rested from November through March. With the sandbed, winter nights were simply nights, dark, cold outside, but warm enough inside that sleep continued unbroken from bedtime to dawn. The restoration of normal sleep patterns had cascading effects on mood, energy, health, and relationships that were visible within weeks of the sandbed's installation, and that persisted for the entire duration of the winter. The warming pattern of the floor itself, The radiant heat that rose from the sand through the planks had a distinctive quality that Parisa described as being like the warmth of sun-heated stone. The warmth was gentle, steady, and came from below, rising through the feet and legs rather than descending from above, and it produced a physical sensation of being supported by warmth rather than surrounded by it. Parisa said that sitting on the warm floor near the stove in the evening felt like sitting in a courtyard in Kashan in late afternoon, when the stone pavement retained the day's heat and radiated it upward through the body. The comparison was not precise. The New Mexico cabin was not a Persian courtyard, but the physical sensation was analogous. Warmth rising from below, steady and reliable, persisting after the heat source had been removed. The fire of October 1897 tested the sand bed's safety properties. A chimney fire, caused by creosote accumulation in a neighbor's stovepipe, spread to the roof and destroyed one cabin in the settlement. The fire raised concerns about the safety of Hamid's sand bed because the stove sat on sand rather than on a fireproof stone slab or tin sheet, and some neighbors worried that the sand could somehow transmit heat to the wooden box and ignite the floor. Hamid demonstrated the safety margin by measurement. During a peak burn with the stove at 400 degrees, the sand temperature at the bottom of the box, directly above the wooden base, was 75 degrees. The sand temperature at the stone lining, the interface between sand and wood, was 80 degrees. The wood ignition temperature is approximately 500 degrees. The safety margin was over 400 degrees. The wooden box would never approach ignition temperature under any normal or abnormal operating condition because the 1,200 pounds of sand between the stove and the box distributed the heat so broadly that no point in the lower sand layer could reach dangerous temperatures. The long-term economics of the sand bed were compelling when calculated over the full period of Hamid's residence. From 1892 through 1908, 16 winters, the sand bed saved approximately 1 cord of wood per winter, for a total savings of 16 cords valued at approximately $110 at local prices. The construction cost was $14. The maintenance cost over 16 years was approximately $0. One tightening of the box hardware in 1900, which took 2 hours and cost nothing. The net economic benefit was approximately $96, a 7-to-1 return on the initial investment. No other improvement in the settlement, not insulation, not chinking, not roof upgrades, achieved a comparable return per dollar invested. Hamid never claimed credit for inventing the sand bed. When asked, he said that the principle was ancient, that the Persians, the Romans, the Chinese, and dozens of other civilizations had used thermal mass to store heat, and that all he had done was apply an old idea to a new stove. This was true, but understated. The specific adaptation, a sand-filled box beneath a cast-iron stove on a wooden floor in a frontier cabin, was Hamid's innovation, and it was an innovation that matched the available materials, free sand, the available skills, basic carpentry, and the specific problem, overnight heat loss in a 2-hour burn stove system, with a precision that no previous application of the thermal mass principle had achieved in the American context. The seasonal rhythm of the sand bed followed a predictable annual cycle. In September, before the first frost, Hamid inspected the box hardware, tightened any loose bolts, and swept the clay tile surface clean. In October, as night temperatures dropped into the 40s, the sand bed began to earn its keep, absorbing the heat from the evening fire and releasing it overnight, smoothing the transition from warm days to cold nights that caught many families off guard. In November, when the overnight lows dropped below freezing for the first time, the sand bed became essential. The difference between a cabin that held 50 degrees at dawn and a cabin that hit 35. Through December, January, and February, the deep cold months when temperatures routinely dropped to single digits, the sand bed operated at full capacity, storing 12,000 BTUs per evening burn and releasing them over 8 hours through the night. In March, as the overnight lows began to moderate, the sand bed continued to provide overnight warmth, but the margin of benefit narrowed as the outdoor temperatures rose. By April, the overnight lows were above freezing, and the sand bed was no longer necessary, though it continued to moderate the temperature swings of the transition season. The children in the settlement knew which cabins had sand beds by the warmth of the floor. When visiting neighbors, a child who stepped onto a warm floor was in a sand bed cabin. A child who stepped onto a cold floor was not. The distinction was immediate, physical, and memorable, and it shaped the expectations of a generation of frontier children who grew up believing that a warm floor was normal and a cold floor was a failure of engineering rather than an inevitable condition of winter. Parisa kept records of the overnight temperatures through 4 winters, a practice she had learned from Hamid, who tracked the temperatures of his copper-working furnace with the same methodical precision. Her records, written in Farsi in a small notebook, documented the performance of the sand bed across a range of exterior conditions. Nights when the outdoor temperature stayed above 20 degrees, dawn interior temperature 52 to 55. Nights when it dropped to single digits, dawn interior 45 to 48. And the single extreme night of the 1895 blizzard when the outdoor temperature reached 4 below zero, dawn interior 45, after a double charge the previous evening. The records confirmed what Hamid had predicted from his understanding of thermal mass physics. The sand bed performed consistently across a wide range of conditions, buffering against the worst cold and maintaining the cabin above the critical 45-degree threshold under all but the most extreme circumstances. No myths, no miracles, just sand, a wooden box, and the understanding that the best fire is the one that keeps warming you hours after the flames have died.